There is indeed a gray area, but you certainly aren't finding it. To cast, in case any of you actually do bother to look at some of the numbers, remember America is one of the most capitalist first world countries in the world, and our test scores suck, our ethical is shambles, our environmental health is piss poor, etc. Europe is so much more socialist and enlightened and doing better in most major categories. We got a free ride from World War II, but we squandered that economic lead, and our problems are catching up to us. It's not just Iraq. Tricky has a simple comparison. God is all that is good. Anything against God is evil. Anarchy is all that is good. Anything against anarchy is evil. You're as blind as the evangelical preachers spouting nonsense about the fallacies of science and the failures of evolution. Examine very close to your assumptions. Are oligarchies moral? Is economic pressure absolved of reproach, being somehow better than physical pressure? Labor at gunpoint and starve point are effectively identical. Wake up. Stepbot, to debate with somebody, you have to take his arguments and prove them inconsistent. That is a lot of work. If you're not up to it, don't bother me with your opinions. Wake up, it's not an argument. Chaos, Stepbot, wake up was the last sentence of a series of comments explaining some rather important arguments. Remember, God created everything is not inconsistent with the facts. He could have placed the fossil record to test us. Is the anarchist belief in the free market scientifically grounded? I think some of you are simply okay with exploitation, oligarchies, and free markets. Or not. Quote, it's all a balancing act. I'm sick of that argument, that and any other argument that involves lousy metaphors that mask the evil violence of the state. Don't worry if we've got guns to your head, it's just part of the balancing act. We're not. Sorry to chaos, I'm sick of that argument, that and any other argument that involves lousy black and white utopian ramblings without clear grounding in reality. I wish we could all have our own little world to play God, and I really do, but we have to share this one, and that means infringing other people's rights sometimes. Coercion via guns and starvation. If a bunch of people are starving stuff and just about other market anarchists forgives them for violating private property, we don't need to overturn the basic idea of respecting private property to the maximum level. Someone to make acceptance for starve point, which mechanism we still haven't explained. How does someone cause someone else to starve without first using coercion by guns? Direct chaos, starve point. Families facing the threat of starvation unless they work under those conditions. Again, those conditions included child labor, 14-hour work days, incredibly unsafe work environments, etc. This is what kickstarted the labor movement. For a bunch, if they're about to starve, then it might be a legitimate resource problem in their particular location. That's simply nature. However, remember that the government was involved in the cities, so it might have been unfair hoarding of resources which government laws supported, so government would be the obstacle in the way of fair use of resources. Most of what you're talking about sounds like bullshit to me, though, because to chaos, they may have used coercion by guns. You're correct. Earlier I mentioned that we stole land from Native Americans. Gunpoints are homesteading justification for current land ownership in most of America is BS. But beyond that, capitalism is shown to increase disparity between rich and poor. Eventually, that disparity can grow to where rich own the factories and poor don't. This is pretty obvious. Continues, so some way or another, minority rich control the means of production, hence jobs, and can take the terms to the majority poor who are facing starvation. Remember, what qualm with anarchism boils down to this: economic coercion can be just as real as physical coercion. Slaves at gunpoint and starve point affected the same. Pepperbunch still didn't explain how people are able to hoard resources. That usually requires picking people off land or not allowing people to use the land in the first place, which is government behavior. However, like I said, now anarchist says that people should starve, so if that scenario occurs when the resources are available to prevent it, the solution is allowed in anarchy, which is that people need to take what they need. Criticus suppose we need a broader discussion of the history of America. In the beginning, we had colonists, and they were good. Some of these colonists went off and conquered Native American territory, which was good. Along the way, immigrants started coming in, poor immigrants looking for work. So we have poor immigrants and colonists. Clearly, the colonies were respectable cities now, with power structures and varying levels of wealth. The immigrants had nothing, so were obviously a starve point, but they chose to move there, yes. Of course, depending on the time period, the move was also a starve point. Overpopulation famines in Europe. Pepperbunch, whatever you're calling capitalism and state capitalism, which you act as if there's a similarity to market anarchy, which you do not give the mechanism for. Homesteading principle doesn't even attempt to justify current ownership. It justifies what people work for without coercion. If items are stolen, it says to return them owners if possible. Current ownership is a hodgepodge of BS. Dirty chaos, say that less regulation approximates free markets. Free markets are the limit as regulation decreases. Sorry to that when we had less regulation, horrendous exploitation occurred. In fact, today, child labor is prevalent in poor countries without regulation. UNICEF, 158 million aged 5 to 14 engaged in child labor. Pepperbunch, wrong because free markets are voluntarily regulated. They don't have less regulation in the sense of less government. They have no government, but plenty of non-government regulation, as in non-monopolistic regulation. Also, your idea of less regulation is arbitrary. Also, child labor makes much more sense than public school, as long as it's not abusive. Dirty chaos, yes, and a government with less and less power approaches government with no power. In the limit, if you have a magical transition happens precisely when there is no government, which does not happen when there is even the tiniest sliver of government, then we need to have a different conversation about why you hold this rather counterintuitive belief. Free market equals more exploitation. Pepperpunch, wrong. Government is monopolistic. Anarchy has polycentric law, not a lack of power. Indeed, that transition does occur when government disappears, because when there's a forced monopoly, then no one else is allowed to regulate, but when that monopoly disappears, others can step in. If the forced monopoly chooses to not regulate, is that not the same as not regulating? As the example goes, the government did not regulate child labor, yet the unopposed free market in child labor did not step up and form regulations on child labor. You must have a point, but I don't see it. Pepperbunch, because it was illegal for anyone else to regulate the market except for the government. When the government disappears, others can't. This is somewhat confusing since the literal definition of regulation is action taken to improve society by an organization with a monopoly on that action. So technically, anarchy can't regulate, but the same action, just different types of organizations. Dirty chaos, the government allows industry to self-regulate, and they do. For example, you're using IP which is not required by the government. It was a standard worked out by industry, a common occurrence in engineering fields, see w3.org. So the labor industry could have self-regulated and decided not to do child labor thing, but they didn't. OSHA benefits, etc. from government. Pepperbunch, indeed we have some freedom, people weren't allowed to tell another business what to do. The government has powers it only allows itself, not to mention that democracy wins in anarchy or the government, so nothing can change in either until a big enough outcry occurs. Democracy wins the government, assuming there's democracy installed in the market, it's always installed. Dirty chaos, a company can choose not to support its standards and thus effectively tell other companies they won't work with them on I'm not quite sure what you mean by tell other businesses what to do, because surely an anarchistic society wouldn't allow one company to dictate the actions of another directly. I just don't understand the statement at all, or really the rest of the comment. Democracy wins in anarchy or the government. Correction, let. Pepperbunch, democracy wins, meaning that enough people have to oppose something with the power to exist to prohibit it in government and in anarchy. Pepperbunch, self-regulation you're referring to is merely for practical economic purposes, so each business volunteers for it. If it's moral to force a business to follow fairer rules for the children working there, polycentric law of anarchy encourages it to be done by any organization powerful enough to do so, whereas government prohibits any organization besides itself from using that force. It's monopoly on force. Turticast, what exactly is the theoretical and the idealized anarchist world force that polycentric law wields to encourage offending organization to comply, and which is illegal now? As an example, boycotting is legal. Pepperbunch, there are many, depending on which government. Boycotting isn't legal everywhere, but in all cases, physical force is prohibited by the government except for enforcing its own laws. You know, the physical force which created minimum wage, outlawed child labor, etc. Pepperbunch, by the way, a lot of the law against child labor is wrong. I'd much rather have a job as a child than be stuck in public schools, as long as I have parents or kind of orphanage protecting me from abuse. Yes, this is a huge problem. You'd be stuck at the bottom of the economic totem pole without an education. How many illiterate people manage upward mobility? You'd be at a huge disadvantage. Public education is even more important to me than antitrust, OSHA, etc., at least on days like this. What good is a free press if the masses can't read? Pepperbunch, no, because reading, writing, and arithmetic are easily taught me by my parents, or by my orphanage tutors, or by my boss, or my job, or by a tutor I hire with my wages. Kids stuck in school, not making money, are at a huge disadvantage since are their parents. Yes, drawing back to historical examples, this clearly was not the case. Children simply went without an education. You are lucky to live in a society with lots of welfare systems to ensure nobody drops that low. What if your parents didn't have an education, and you were working at a job that didn't require one, which would be self-evident? Your boss wouldn't teach you. A tutor might be too expensive, see the danger. It's a statistical fact that people from districts with more money do better. Children from poor, failing inner-city schools are being left behind. Privatizing education will just kick them off a cliff. How many do you think would get an education if they had to pay for it? My logical guess, way fewer. Pepperbunch, most vote fixed our quality of life, in my view, was private property and the Industrial Revolution, increasing production, including a discovery of oil energy. Whatever you relate to welfare is insignificant, as even a good friend could teach me to read for free. Chaos, you're right in the sense that technology is the greatest force of social advancement ever. That doesn't mean we should let it drown out innovation or downright immoral actions of those who wield advanced technology. Simply because slaves lived better as time progressed doesn't mean that slavery was moral. Pepperbunch, but we can't control morality since it is subjective. If we don't recognize people's right to their own morality to the greatest degree, what we encourage is tyranny. The idea that we should encourage a monopoly on the power for regulation negates individual moralities. The poor outnumber the rich, so they always have the advantage if there's a market for regulation instead of monopoly. Pepperbunch, some education history misses. As far as market failure, our government services fail at economic calculation, resulting in more waste. As far as there being options for voluntary regulations amidst government, if not illegal, those options, charity, boycott, regulation, are often discouraged because they amount to double tax. When you have someone who's supposed to fix things charging you money, then you don't fix them yourself. To cast re-education, I use Wikipedia because it least tries for neutrality. However, it seems clear we're too deep in this debate with all the Mrs. Cato libertarian writings being thrown away, so here's some hardball people for the American way. In summary, more kids would probably get left behind if education goes purely for profit. Relying on charity to make up the difference is dangerous. Links suck, I'll make this video. Pepperbunch, I'm stuck at the bottom of the totem pole right now and I went through public education. By the way, back to the starve point argument. Do you see now that nearly everyone makes an exception to private property when starving? So your starve point argument doesn't justify regulations against private property not meant to feed starving people, and do you agree that regulations against PP should be the last option tried? Chaos, I totally agree education sucks, but I don't know of any modern nation that is totally private education, which I'm like number 10 in education spending as a percent of GDP. Pepperbunch, and we spend trillions for Iraq when 50 billion could feed most starving people according to the World Bank. Anarchy is simply the end state of a society of smart people who don't bow down to blatant waste such as the government. Chaos, Iraq is the rallying cry of libertarians like Ron Paul because it resonates with Democrats. That doesn't mean we Democrats will betray our welfare values. If we got rid of all government, there would be even less welfare. This should be obvious. We should campaign to end wars and divert that money to better causes, but not in government because of the dangers of free markets. Pepperbunch, it's not obvious there'd be less charity. If people stop paying taxes, it's obvious there'd be less war because there's no overall profit in it. Realize that when people are taxed to take care of society, they quit trying other ways to take care of society because they'd be double taxed. The inefficiency of central planning economics is far worse than market failure. Also, when you use guns to rearrange society, you tend to create war machines. Tortikias, quote, nearly everyone makes an exception to private property when starving. So the poor could have taken up arms and stolen food at gunpoint. I think you should be careful in saying everyone would agree with this. Even if you accept that, why stop at starvation? What if they can live homeless on the street but be fed without working in crazy dangerous situations, but if they want any kind of clothing or home, they need to submit their children to gruesome labor 14 hours a day, etc., etc. Pepperbunch's starve point argument is arbitrary. Everyone works at starve point, including slave masters, or everyone is in danger of starving. Even if they have money, they could be jailed and starved. I've yet to see a good example I use useful. Gun pressure rearrangement of society, whatever cases there are far enough in between so as not to use taxes. Neutral form. Dotika asks, quote, boycotting isn't legal everywhere. When it's about a moral issue such as child labor, I'm pretty sure boycotts are legal. Only when there's an ulterior motive behind the boycott such as anti-competitive is it illegal. Quote, but in all cases, physical force is prohibited by the government except for enforcing its own laws. It would also be prohibited in an anarchistic society, yes? No government guns or never guns stealing your money, right? Pepperbunch, no, it would not in all cases. It depends on the organizations. The people would choose which laws they enforce. It all depends on what people think is moral to do. Right now, people think it's moral to ally my money to the U.S. government against my will. I don't.